Hi, I'm just going to give it another couple of minutes for a few people to jump on before I get cracking. Apologies for the awkward silence. Just give it a little bit longer. Now would be an actually real ideal time if there's anything that you want me to discuss with the unseen poetry during the lesson or anything you're not sure of. Now's the time to pop some ideas down in the chat so we can do that. If there's anything you would like to chat about. Let's give it another minute or so. Right, I think we will start and then people can join us as we go along. So welcome back. Thank you very much for coming. So today we're doing English literature based on the AQA example because that's the most popular one. However, if you're not doing AQA, that's fine. There's still loads of stuff that you can take from this lesson. So you won't be sort of wasting time or anything like that. There's still stuff that's really valid and you can take to other exam boards. Just how the question might be laid out is slightly different. So today we are going to be looking at Island Man, which is a really nice short little poem that's got loads of stuff crammed into it. One of my favourite ones to teach, by a lady called Grace Nichols, who is the partner of John Agard. So if you're doing the Power and Conflict bundle, he wrote Checking Out My History. He wrote Half Caste as well, which is a really, really amazing poem. It's very, very clever. And Grace Nichols writes sort of things of a similar idea. They're both from South America and they moved over to Britain in the 70s. So a lot of it is to do with racism and identity and just sort of generally sort of the concept of home and what does that mean. So they're absolutely fab to look at, both of them. They do some really lovely work. So if you haven't been before and you don't know me, my name is Vicky. I studied English language and linguistics at uni as my undergrad. Then I trained as a teacher and qualified 2019. And I'm doing my 800th lesson tomorrow morning. Very, very close. I'm very excited. I'm thinking I'm going to have to start buying myself little party poppers to celebrate my little victories. So same LOs as always from the last couple of sessions. So understanding what the question format is for unseen poetry and understand how we can apply poetic devices to a text and sort of work out how everything works essentially. So I've shown you this last 2 weeks and I'm just going to show you it again so we're really set on we know what we're doing. So in the exam you will be given 2 poems that you haven't seen before. One will be longer than the other and that will be your 24 marker. So we'll be working on the 24 marker today. The length of Island Man is quite short, so I think probably in a standard exam you might be more likely to see this as your comparison poem for just your 8 marks. It's really not that, well, it's not massively long. Laid out on a page it looks relatively long, but there's not masses of words actually going on. They're quite short lines. So I'd say more likely to come across it in the other one, in the comparison, but that's not to say that it isn't a really rich text, because it is. It's an absolutely fab poem. So a couple of past papers, so you get in and then whatever the poem How does the poem present? That always stays the same. And then depending on the poem, it usually is the effects of a particular event, or about a relationship or an attitude, which is what we're going to be looking at today. We're going to be looking at attitudes. So this will become clear shortly, what on earth these two pictures have to do with Island Man. So we've got a nice tropical beach on the left-hand side, and we've got a motorway on the right-hand side. So how are they different, and what did they make you think of? What sort of connotations pop into your head just by looking at those two pictures? So answers in the chat and Q&A as always. If you've got any ideas, so I will pop some ideas down myself, and then you can add some extra bits and pieces on if you want to. So I'm going to throw out a piece of terminology to start off with, because this is sort of the backbone of the poem. So these are what we would call a juxtaposition. So a juxtaposition is, in this case, two things which have opposite ideas, meanings, feelings, that sort of thing. So on this side, we've got something that is very tropical, serene, beautiful, and we would probably associate this with holidays. At least in our country, that would be a holiday, because we don't have any beaches that look like that in the UK. And then I suppose we've got this idea of heat and it being pleasant to be there, and being peaceful, quiet, and just generally enjoyable. And then on the right-hand side, so this is the North Circular Road in London. It's a really, really busy road, as you can see. So with this, we've got a lot of greys. It's quite dim. I'd say a little bleak. I think this is probably taken sort of as either the sun's coming up or the sun's setting, hence why it looks a bit darker. And essentially, would we want to be here? Probably not. So we've got this massive traffic jam going on, which is probably irritating, annoying. It's not calming in any way, frustrating. So two very, very different locations, and hence why we call it a juxtaposition. So this is the poem. Now, what I was going to do, and I've forgotten to get the link up, was to show you a video of it. It's not particularly exciting, but I tend to think that my students actually quite like just having it visualized and then having it put to music. So morning, here we go. An island, I think it helps to set the scene a little bit more. The sound of blue surf in his head, the steady breaking and booming, while the seabirds and fishermen pushing out to sea, the sun surfacing defiantly from the east of his small emerald island. He always comes back groggily, groggily. Comes back to sands of a grey metallic soar, to surge of wheels, to dull north circular roar, muffling, muffling his crumpled pillow waves. Island man heaves himself. Another
London, day.
Right. So, as I said, it's quite a short poem, but there's lots to unpack. The imagery is absolutely fantastic in this. So, as I said, anything that you want to bring up that you want me to talk about, please do mention it in the chat and we can do that. So, what's really nice about that video is it gives you a very distinct difference between the two viewpoints, the idea of dreaming and go from one to the other, and sort of that nice sense of identity. This is set on a Caribbean island, and sort of having that gentle reggae playing in the background, I think sort of really nicely adds to that identity. So, as you can see, it's not particularly long. There isn't absolutely masses to go at. And I don't know whether that's a blessing or a curse for thinking an exam. I think I might want something slightly more than this if I was sitting in an exam and asked to do a 24 marker. Because I think the more we have, we think we've got more to say, but if we have too much, then we tend to be overwhelmed by it. Hence why you don't get a poem that is really, really long, because you just wouldn't have time to digest all of it. So, our question for today is going to be, in Island Man, how does the poet present the subject's attitudes and opinions of location? So I've taught quite a while my flatters table, which is form and structure, language devices, attitudes of the speaker, themes, emotivity and mood, readers' thoughts, and sounds. I just realised I've been counting those off. You couldn't see my fingers. So this is something which I thought might be useful as well, a slightly more simplistic way to tackle poetry, and something that a lot of schools teach, and that I've taught in schools, more so with my Key Stage 3. But with flatters tables, they're really quite complex, and this is 24 marks. You haven't got lots and lots of time to beautifully draw out a table and think about all these things in really detailed depths. So if you're someone who really struggles with unseen poetry and finds the flatters table a bit overwhelming and there's too much going on, this is almost like a really nice simplified version. But pretty much I'm going to show you that everything that is in the flatters table can be slotted into one or two of these categories. So I'm going to go with this today as a nice change, because I thought it'd be interesting to do something which isn't just filling in a flatters table. And then we can look at how we could distribute all of these into a flatters table. So if you're someone, I'd say anywhere aiming up for grade 6 or below, using Smile would serve you really, really well. And you'd probably, you'd cover most of the things anyway. If you're heading for 7, 8 and 9, I'd suggest going for something with the flatters table, because with this you miss out on themes a little bit, and that's a really big thing in poetry. And we don't really talk about the emotivity so much with this, I don't think, anyway. So I think this is pretty solid for grade 6 and below in the exam. 7, 8 and 9, you might want to have something that's a little bit more complex, but it's not that much more complex in reality, really. It's what you do with it in your writing. So we've talked about structure over the past couple of lessons, and I've given you various examples of what's going on. So these are the main 3 structures that you are probably likely to get thrown at you. They are generally the most easy to see and find. So sonnets are really, really obvious and tend to scream out on the page to you. So sonnets are poems that are 14 lines long. They have a formal rhyming scheme. There's lots of rules to be learnt, and they have what we call an iambic pentameter, which I will write down because it's a right mouthful. So, iambic pentameter. And what that means essentially is you have 10 syllables and every other syllable is stressed. English language is a language where we use stress. We don't use stress to convey meaning though. So if you go to another language, the way you produce a particular sound, and whether you say it high pitch, low pitch, or if you elongate it, or if it's very short, can change the meaning of that word. So we have essentially 5 groupings. So we have a stressed and an unstressed, stressed and unstressed, and we have that 5 times, which is 10 syllables per line. So we have that alternating. Now, a sonnet we looked at with Westminster Bridge, which was 2 weeks ago. So with sonnets, they are a solid 14-line poem and they are not interrupted. And then we've got ballads. We haven't looked at a ballad yet. So a ballad is pretty much, these are definitions I've just grabbed off Google Dictionary because I thought they did it in a really beautiful potted way. So a ballad is generally a poem that has some sort of rhyming scheme and tends to have stanzas which are the same length throughout, and they tend to be, and links to the idea of ballad songs being something that sort of nicely works within a music setting if you set it to music. So that's a ballad. We haven't looked at one. I'm going for Wordsworth again here as an example. On the Power and Conflict bundle, the prelude is a ballad. Free verse is pretty much anything goes, you do what you like. So there's no rhyming, or at least no regular rhyming. It's a bit all over the shop. And the stanza lengths are irregular, some are longer than others, and there doesn't really actually seem to be any reason behind that. So with that in mind, what structure do you think we've got? I apologise for my slurping, by the way. So I think it's worth, because how this is formatted it a little bit. Has squashed it all up together. So where I've just drawn that line is a break in stanzas. And then again here it's all clumped it up together, and here as well. Free verse, yeah, absolutely. So we've got 5 lines, and then we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So we've got 5, 7, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, another 7, and then just 1 line. So it's free. So then the question that we have to ask ourselves is, why use that structure? So with sonnets are traditionally to do with love. So we can usually expect to see some display of affection and love in there. However, that we don't have that. So that's the main reason for sonnets. Ballads tend to be more sort of romanticism era, so Wordsworth, Shelley and alike. However, they're usually quite serene and really well controlled. Free verse just allows you to do whatever you want. So usually the people and poets who use free verse tend to want to be expressive and not be constrained. And what I mean by that is that their creativity isn't limited. So they essentially write what they want to write, and they don't look and think, oh, I've only got 5 words that I can use here, and which 5 are the best. Essentially, there's this freedom, and it allows a wider vocabulary choice. If you've got a rhyming scheme, then your vocab choice becomes limited towards the end of the sentences, because it's really difficult to do. And then we've also got the additional question of, okay, so if we haven't got a rhyming structure that's solid, why might that be? And quite frequently, it tends to be either to show a range of emotions, or to show lots of ideas, and sort of having so many ideas that they're sort of bumping into one another and it's going really, really quickly at a fast pace. Now, here, our poem is generally quite chilled out. It's really nice, it's really smooth, and it's very relaxing. So, why is it like that? And the answer to that is that it's very smooth. It goes from line to line. Have we got any punctuation? No. So the entirety of this text is what we call a caesura. So it's not, it's what we call enjambment. I've had a moment. So enjambment is where we have one line that runs into another without there being any punctuation in the way. So, for example, having a comma at the end or having a full stop. That isn't enjambment, that's the opposite. So if we get rid of those, then we've got enjambment. Caesura, I will quickly explain, is where you have a full stop, exclamation mark, or question mark, anything with a dot at the bottom of it in the middle of a line. So for example, the sun, and then if you put a full stop in there, surfacing defiantly, that's a caesura. So we've got masses and masses of enjambment throughout, and it is very, very smooth as we go along. So we've pretty much dealt with structure there, and rhyming scheme. Have we got any rhyming? I don't think so. I'm just having a quick whiz through. We've got a little, so we've got saw and raw here. Waves. Shout out if you can see something that I can't see. I think it's just those two. I think. So we've got a tiny bit. But again, that seems really bizarre, doesn't it? Just to have a one-off. So why might she do this? So this man is dreaming about his home country that he's moved away from in the Caribbean, and now lives in the middle of London. So he is woken up by the sound of the traffic in rush hour, which is all to do with sound. So we could potentially say, oh, well, she's chosen to add that little bit of rhyme in to perhaps show that there's this constant sound going on. She might not have, but that's something that we could potentially offer as a suggestion if we wanted to be really clever. I always feel aware when I come up with things like that I don't want to be that teacher that you see in the meme where it's like, oh, the curtains are blue, and then the teacher says, so what does that mean? And everyone's like, the curtains are blue, and the teacher says, no, it shows that the person is depressed. So with that sort of one, I think it might potentially be a bit of a leap. But I think for GCSE, if you wrote that in your exam, the examiner would actually be really impressed with that you'd thought about it that far and tried to make a pattern out of it. So although it's slightly far out there, I think it makes you stand out, and it's shown that you've tried to think about something in actually a lot of depth. Right, so in terms of smile then, so we've covered structure. Now I'm going to look at meaning and language. So I've got positive, neutral, and negative in terms of her word choices. So I'm going to go through and highlight a few for each potentially. And if you want to shout out to me which ones you think are positive, negative, or neutral, that's fine. And then as on the back of that, we've got to say, well, why does she do that? So you'll soon see that there's a clear pattern to establish here. So we start off with blue surf. We start off with wombing. So wombing is essentially sort of being sort of like in a little cocoon. So like a baby in a womb, sort of being really comfortable and cared for and looked after and nice and warm and cozy. That's what wombing means. And then we've got sun surfacing defiantly, small emerald island, and then we've got back to the sands, but that actually is a metaphor. Then we've got groggily, grey metallics, or rather, dull north circular roar. Muffling, I think I would say is sort of relatively neutral. I think that could be a good or a bad thing, depending on the context. I think here it's probably a bad thing, but there we go. And then we've got heaves himself, and the use of another London day. Like, this is repetitive and inescapable, and this is constantly, this is his life going round in circles like Groundhog Day. So from that, you can see already that we start off with loads of positives, lots and lots of them going on. And then as we go on, about halfway through, things start to change and it starts to become more negative. However, we don't have lots of just red in the bottom half. We have a couple of other bits which link back to the positiveness of that dream that he has. So that's something that's worth keeping an eye open for as well, and actually mentioning that it's not straight stanzas 1 and 2, it's all positive, and then stanzas 3 and 4 are all negative. It's nice to see that pattern, and that pattern isn't really, really strict, because then you're picking up on the sort of more intricate details of the poem as you go along. So why choose these words? So the vast majority of these, I think, are absolutely fabulous in terms of imagery, and I'm going to show you a few that I've picked out for imagery and why they are useful and helpful. So I've picked out 5. 4 of them I would say are positive, and the bottom right I would say is negative. So with that, we then have to work out, okay, so we know it's imagery. Have we got any other language devices going on? If we have, how is that useful? Why is it there? How does it add to the poem? So, Sound of Blue Surf. So, let's change to pen. So, first thing which is really sort of obvious is that it's metaphorical. And then we've got a reference to colour as well, which is important because we see that later. And we've also got use of senses, because it's talking about what you can hear. Now, blue surf, sometimes when I've taught this a couple of times, students aren't sure what blue surf is. So I will show you a quick picture. So it's sort of the foamy white part that it's referring to. So where the waves actually crash and land onto the beach. That's what it's referring to. So that's our first one. Metaphor, we've only got a few words for each of these, so unpacking them, not all of them have loads and loads that we can talk about. Sun surfacing defiantly. So we've got some sibilants. It's our first obvious one, so sun surfing, that's sibilants. Sun surfacing defiantly. Now, can a sun surface defiantly? No, is the answer. A sun cannot be defiant. So defiant meaning that it's strong and it's going to do whatever it wants to do, whether anybody likes it or not. So we then have personification going on in there. And we've got this idea that this sun is really powerful and is not to be messed with, and is sort of almost like a beacon of hope almost. So the imagery is really, really strong with that one. His small emerald island, I think this is the one that you can unpack the most. So, small emerald island. The first thing that I pick out is emerald can have 2 meanings. Number 1, it is just a colour. So again, we've got another colour coming up. The other one being that it's a precious stone. So if we have a precious stone, that means it's got a lot of worth and value and is rich in some sense. Now, how could we interpret that in terms of how Island Man feels? And I think probably we could say that the value of it is that it is his home, he identifies with it, and he thinks that it is something which is really beautiful. So it's sort of one of those things that you sort of can't put a price on, because it is so important to somebody and the memories that is attached. Then we've got the idea that it's small. So the idea that it is relatively inconsequential, in that it's in the Caribbean and it's just getting on and everyone there's just doing their own things, and really the rest of the world don't really know too much about it. It's quite nice and peaceful. And it also refers to it as his. So it's referring to it as a possession, almost like this island is his and only his. And he doesn't share it with anybody else, which of course isn't the case, because very, very few people actually own islands. And if he did own islands, it would be very, if he did own that island, I think it would be relatively unlikely that he would be living in an area where it's sort of really, the sound pollution is really quite poor. Right, so let me scroll down a little bit. So crumpled pillow waves. So crumpled, I think generally is seen as a negative, but in this case I think it's quite positive. I think it's cozy. It mirrors the roughness of waves. And the idea that sort of the island has spilled onto his pillow as the result of the dreams, which I think is really, really nice, and a really nice subtle bit of imagery. Now, dull north circular raw. So again, we've got a reference to colour, this time negative. The North Circular is a road in London, the picture that I showed you at the start. And we've got the fact that it is roaring. So we've got personification. But we've also got something else, which is fairly interesting, I think. So this is something that I only found by accident a few months ago. Raw is an example of zoomorphism, which sounds like an incredibly complicated word, and actually it's not that bad. So zoomorphism is where you have something which isn't that particular animal making a sound which you associate with a particular animal. So for example, raw, we would look at we would link that to probably lion the most, and I'll come back to that in a minute. Gnaw, we would tend to think of either rabbits or rats. Generally, those are the main two. Obviously, there's a lot of other animals that gnaw, but those are I think the most prevalent ones that spring to mind. You could have something like ribbit, which we would expect a frog to make, or just amphibians generally. Howling for wolves. So there's all sorts of things that we could describe, and we go and think of semantically, we go raw, lion. So here's another thing which I think is out of the box and a little bit more of a stretch. So one of our main animals, like our representation of Britain and England, is a lion. So, and you can see that Nelson's columns, is there 3 or 4 lions? I can't remember. And you'll see lions sort of on various bits and pieces of sort of like the monarchy stuff. And I went to a school which was a Queen Elizabeth school, and I think we had like lions, not like really nice ones, but sort of like the archaic ones, stood on their hind legs on our emblem, I think. So you could potentially link that to that being sort of like our national animal, even though we don't have lions in this country. So you could make that leap if you want to. And I think it's, again, out there, but I think the examiner would appreciate the thought process that got you there. And being outlandish in some ways, I think sort of pays off. Examiners want to see something which, you know, isn't the standard. Everyone's going to go for this analysis. Having something which is a bit out there is always fun for examiners, and teachers get very excited by those sorts of analysis. So in terms of effects, I've tried to water down a little bit. Obviously, you need to go further than this to be able to get your top grades. But essentially, using these questions for sort of like as your quick buzz questions before you go into the exam, and sort of these are the things you need to consider as you go along. These are good to sort of memorize and know that you need to be looking for these sorts of things. So, use of certain words. Can you link any? So I've sort of alluded to a link that we could talk about, and then as a consequence, what does that make us think of? So you could go off and talk about connotations. You could potentially go off and talk about other language devices as well and how they link together. How the poet feels, so how they are showing their ideas and attitudes through a poem. So for example, Grace Nichols here is showing her love for her own home country that she doesn't visit particularly often. What does the poet want us to feel? One of the big things that I have with my students is that they say, oh, Vicky, but like, you know, when my school says, you know, how does this poem make you feel? I'm not really that bothered, which is completely fine. So then just make an educated guess as to what you think it might make somebody feel. And why the poet wants us to think that way as well. What value does that add to that poem and to its meaning? And then how, if you've got a particular subject like we have here, we have Island Man as our subject, how is that person feeling? And is that the same as what you think the narrator might be feeling? Why have they written this poem in the first place? What's the point? So those are a few nice questions to sort of get you, prompt questions to get you going, and then hopefully you'll sort of start gathering speed and sort of snowballing. So I thought it would be a good idea to just quickly think about the types of themes and the types of things that are being discussed, and how they contradict each other, and whether there's anything that we can bring the two together with. So hence Venn diagram. So in the first one, we've got this really strong sense of belonging, and that belonging and their heart being in the Caribbean. The idea of that place being incredibly precious, and vibrant and colourful. And also there's a mention of wildlife as well. It mentions wild seabirds, and it mentions fishermen going out to sea, so we can assume that there's enough fish there to make a living off. It doesn't do that in England, when, you know, there will be birds making a racket, but it's not mentioned. So with England, it's quite anonymous in that we don't really have that much detail, apart from it being noisy outside and being quite dull. We aren't really told anything else. So because we've got that lack of detail, it gives Island Man this sense of it just being such a vast place that he can't really sort of see himself and how he fits into that area potentially. And then we've got this idea that it is really dull as well. It seems quite boring and unexciting. If I read this, would I want to go to London? No. So it influences how we think of the place, and the idea that it is industrial as well. So everything is sort of quiet and picturesque and nice in the home country. And then with this one, there's a lot going on. There's lots of machinery and it's manic. So the mood is very, very different. Right, so in terms of how can we link them together, I think it's really, really difficult to link them together. So really, the only thread that pulls these two together is the fact that Island Man has lived in both countries, and that they've been lived in and visited by as well. So there isn't a lot to go on at all in terms of how you can link the two together, because there just really isn't a lot. And in terms of London and how it's being portrayed, we've got so little of what is going on in London compared to what we've been given proportionally for the island that Island Man is from, that there aren't masses of things that we can pull together to say, oh, that's similar and that's similar. We've got the idea of sounds. We've got the mention of blue surf, the sound of that. We've got wild seabirds. So we've got different sounds coming in both of them, but the sounds are sort of different levels of pleasantness. So in terms of themes, how can we work out themes from what we've got there? So we've got the idea of worth, and that could be self-worth and sort of how a country is valued as well. We've got the idea of home and nationality. We've also got the idea of, I would say, rich versus poor, maybe. Patriotism as well. Really important for this one. And potentially developing countries versus developed countries. Now, we could potentially say, well, it's a lot quieter in Island Man's home country because perhaps it's not quite as developed, it's not as industrial than England is. That might be a reason for the difference in noise. It might just be that that particular area of the island where he lives is just really quiet and off the beaten track. So we're not quite sure, and particularly when you're doing an unseen poem, you can't go off and Google and work out whether that's got any mileage or not. So if you think, I think that might be the case, say it tentatively, but don't worry about it too much and don't spend loads of time on it unless there is really nothing else that you can say or write. So, oh, that's rubbish. So I've put quickly, how does this fit into the Flatters table? So structure is quite obviously form and structure. Language devices, so that's obviously language and imagery. Attitudes, meaning and effect. Themes, meaning, emotivity, effect. Readers' thoughts, imagery and effect, and sounds, language. So they work in really nicely, but with Flatters, you've potentially got more mileage of the sorts of things you could think about. Because with emotivity, that's relatively specific, where if I just asked you what the effect of the poem was, that could take a variety of different avenues and branches. So that's something to bear in mind. I've got a Kahoot to finish off with today, by the way. So we'll see how many of us are here and how many want to have a go if we do that. Right, so in terms of modelling, so I haven't gone through and absolutely sort of gutted the poem as I perhaps would do in the exam. So I like to print my poems off and then annotate them because I'm that sort of person. So you can see that I've written absolutely loads on it. But generally, I've tried to make it as sparse as I possibly can. And not always is there something on every line. So you can see I've got sort of gaps here and there. So I could go off and do that, but I've just chosen a few things rather than sort of going through it with a fine-tooth comb. So with that in mind, let's move that out of the way. I've got lots of stuff just hanging about. Right, so again, I'm going to use sort of P paragraphs as a rough structure. I'm not going to stick entirely to it because we need to take things further in terms of our analysis and just sort of our basic low level. So my point in this poem, and as always, I'm making sure that I'm getting the poet's name in there just to show off, creates a clear juxtaposition. So this is the main thing. To me, this is the most obvious thing about the poem. So hence why I'm getting in to start off with. And then off the back of this paragraph, I can talk about lots of different elements of why that's happening rather. So between island man's native country and his current residence, which is London, England. So now with this, I'm not going for a straightforward point evidence. I'm making quite a long point with this. I've sort of done my basic point, and now I'm going on to sort of take it further and bring those two things together, particularly when it's with juxtapositions. You're talking about a variety of bits and pieces from across the poem, and you can be grabbing all sorts of bits and pieces, and juxtaposition is quite hard to tailor a paragraph to, or at least I think it can be for some students. So the poet successfully contrasts, so I'm making sure that the examiner is super aware that I know what juxtaposition means. The two by presenting island man's country as serene. I'm going to put home country in there. As serene. Now I'm going to start embedding my quotations. So his small emerald island. And then I'm going to go off and analyze that in detail, and then I'll come to the next bit slightly later on. So the use of emerald. So I'm now zooming in on a word, and I'm going to go for the use of the oh, actually, I was thinking, I'll put my word class in there. So if it's an emerald in terms of a stone, if we interpret it in that way, then it's a noun. If it's an emerald and just the colour emerald, then that would be an adjective. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to try and suggest those two different interpretations. So I can't just say the noun or the verb, because I'm going to try and plump for two of them, and the idea that it's a little bit ambiguous. And unfortunately, English, we have a lot of words where, depending on the context, they can belong to 2 or 3 different word classes, which is a real pain. So learning how to identify them is a really nice way to do some revision for English, I think. So I'm going to leave that as it is. The use of, where'd I got to? Emerald. Could suggest, again, I'm being tentative here, that island man views his country as precious, like an emerald stone, beautiful and expensive. So I'm pointing out the symbolism there. Alternatively, so it's, again, providing alternative interpretations is really how you hit those top marks. Emerald could, what's that? Be a reference to the rich, luscious colour of green. Right, so I've given a couple of different interpretations there, and I could go on to talk about it, the metaphor as well that it is. I'm just having a quick scan to see whether I've actually written about that somewhere else. We'll see how we go for time. I might add it in later on. Right, okay, so this is a stark contrast, spell contrast correctly, with London. where Nichols uses the adjectives grey and dull. So let's put that in. So to describe the landscape, just to make that really clear that they are both describing landscapes. This could where were we? This could reflect the miserableness the subject is feeling due to being uprooted to a different country. Or this could be an accurate representation of the scene and how it clearly differs to the other location. So I haven't gone and done point evidence analysis, whatever. I've gone with the flow and tried to be as clever as I can with the structure, not being straitjacketed by it. So I've got quite a lengthy point, sort of like an introductory point, and then my sort of main point to actually embed my quotation in. Then I embed my quotation. I then look at a single word, pull it apart, give some alternative analysis. So I'm doing some really strong, deep analysis there. Then I go on and contrast it with something that happens later on. Again, point, evidence. Then I give a couple of alternatives in terms of why the writer might have chosen to do that. Right. Throughout the poem, Nichols creates a soundscape in order to represent the different locations. So I can never spell Caribbean correctly. The Caribbean island has calming sounds, which could, again, I'm being tentative, explain why Island Man visits this place in a dream. And then I'm going to talk about what dreams are. So dreams are commonly seen as a reaction to our subconsciousness. Longings. Dreams more specifically, so I'm sort of trying to eliminate the nightmare thing here, are seen as positive experiences. The use of the sensory description, so I'm throwing in some more terminology, such as, now I'm going to embed my quotation, such as sound of blue surf and what's the other one I wanted? Wild seabirds are sounds that people commonly find soothing. However, for the subject, they seem to be symbolic. Seem to be symbolic associations of home. And I'm going to contrast it again. So this is a clear contrast. So again, I'm still building on that first initial point that I made. Contrast. Let's go for contradiction, actually. Against what we are told about London. So Now I've got surge of wheels and dull north, circular roar. The zoomorphism. Let's get some more terminology in, and I'm being specific about which one example it is in. Makes it clear that the sound is deafening. One most commonly associates roaring with lions. This imagery could lead the reader to feel that such a sound is powerful and intimidating to Island Man. So the big thing that I want you to take away from this is that I'm being tentative. I'm not saying this tells me that. I'm saying this could show, this might be the case. I'm giving alternative analyses. So I'm giving one of more point of view, essentially. A few extra things going on. I'm not going to worry about doing the Kahoot because there's few of us. So I'm not sure it would be worth doing. And it's just going over some of the things that I've already told you about today anyway. So I will read you my final paragraph, and then if you've got any other questions, the time is to ask it is now. So pop anything in the chat that you would like to know. So it is clear from the poem that Island Man feels a sense of belonging and patriotism to his home country. So now I'm talking about themes more specifically. Breaking and wombing. Wombing could symbolise heritage and belonging, as every person is birthed from their mother's womb. The concept of the sound of the sea making him feel could convey a sense of safety and relaxation, similar to a baby in the womb. Opposingly, his reality allows him to feel anonymous in an industrial England. When Island Man wakes, his realisation of his current location is presented negatively. Island Man heaves himself. The alliterative phrase shows his dislike for another London day. It could be inferred that this is due to the vast population of the city and his wish for a quieter life. So that is it. That is us done for the analytical section. So if there's anything you want to ask, now is your time.